Today's webinar is entitled The EU Response to the COVID-19 Outbreak, From Managing the Emergency to Relaunching the Economy. And it is brought to you by the European American Chamber of Commerce, where Europeans and Americans connect to do business. I'm Todd Schwartz, Executive Director of the European American Chamber in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I will be your host today. We have over almost 200 people registered for today's event from around the world. So I'm sure we're going to have a very vibrant transatlantic and international discussion. Now, you will have seen their biographies when you registered, so let me just quickly introduce our presenters today. Elena Flores is the Director for International Economic and Financial Relations and Global Governance with the European Commission's Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs. She joins us today from Brussels. And leading today's discussion is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. She is the Executive Director of the New York chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce. Yvonne, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Thank you, Todd, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our discussion this morning. And welcome, Elena. Good to see you. Before joining the Director General for ECOFIN, Elena worked on budgets and particularly in undertaking financial reforms for the European community. And she also headed the unit for financial markets and public finance, which makes her the perfect conversation partner for our discussion today. And she has done extensive work on COVID-19, the EU response, and will be making her presentation for us to understand what both sides can learn from one another this is not an opportunity to point fingers. This is an opportunity to learn and see what's working, what's not working, and to better prepare for the next crisis. And we believe that both the EU and the US should work together and collaborate on some of the responses. And it's going to be very interesting to see how structurally we addressed the issues in Europe and maybe what we need to do structurally to change in the United States. And with that, I am handing over to Elena to get the conversation going. She's going to present an overview of what happened and where we're taking it from here. Elena?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And thanks, Yvonne, for the opportunity to speak at this webinar. I think it's almost a premiere for me to do this kind of conversation on the screen. So no, I think it's really what you said is very opportune, because I think we are all, US, Europe, and all the others in the searching mood, in really finding out how to address this crisis, how to better relieve the damages, and how to better face the recovery. And I can tell you that I just came out from a G7 deputy school, and clearly the mood is for cooperation. So I think that's at least something that I think we are learning very, very hard and very quickly, that if someone had some doubts about that, I think it's clear that we need to cooperate in this endeavor that we are all facing together. As you will see along my presentation, there are still a lot of things in the making. So more than fully fledged responses, I think that I would be very grateful also to get ideas, suggestions, other views on how to do things, because we can do it better. So I would share with you quickly an overview of the EU policy response. And basically what I will show you in the slides, just to give some impressions about where we are in Europe and compare a bit US, Europe on the big data. All these to be taken with a lot of caution, because numbers are just to give an idea. I don't think that one should pay too much attention on specific numbers, but just the orders of magnitude. And by the way, today the European Commission published the spring forecast. So right after the talk, you can go and have a look. I think it's, again, it's a very difficult forecast exercise for everybody, but more than the specific, very detailed number, it's important to see how the economic situation is seen and what we can learn as potential elements for the outlook. Now, if I would summarize the sort of the responses in terms of policy measures that the EU has been putting on the table, both at the European Union level and at the level of member states, I would say there is the first phase of the response, which is the relief, so the immediate response to manage the emergency, which is not a minor thing. Second, the resilience. So all the measures that are being put in place to bridge the economy through the lockdown period. And then the recovery, which is a package of measures that are currently being shaped to relaunch the European economic activity. And that third package is the one that I would say is still very much in the making. I was hoping to have a proposal out already this week from the European Commission, but we are not yet there. So it might be in the coming days. So it's still maybe this week or next week, but I will give you at the end of the presentation some flavor of what we think we will see in that package. Going to the first slide, just to give a broad picture that I think by now is well known. You see here the timing of the shock, the severity of the impact, and then the extent of the lockdown measures, which is the line that it is we have been using here, and so-called the Stringency index that has been elaborated by the University of Oxford, that shows an aggregate of the policy measures in terms of closing, basically closing schools, closing business, closing entertainment, restaurants, etc., or closing fully the moves of the population. So you see that the developments here in the US and Europe are pretty close, and I think it's more just a question of timing when things started in Europe, started a bit earlier, and then followed in the US in a very similar way. The same for the lockdown measures, with, again, you have that in the US also some different approaches across states. We have a bit the same in Europe, but overall is very similar. So I would say some slight differences in the stringency, but by quite radical in terms of lockdown. Now we are a bit later in the timetable that you see here, and we are starting to experience in most of the European countries the starting time of the deconfinement. And there I think it's extremely prudent, the approach that everybody is following. So it will be starting, but very, very gradual, to test the waters and see if let's say the results that we are seeing on the health side, the positive results, if they stay and they are maintained once the deconfinement starts. Now, moving to the first phase of the response, and the next slide, you can see what I called the relief part of the policy response, which is managing the emergency. So what has the European Union has done for that matter? Well, first of all, the first thing was to organize the joint procurement of medical equipment and supplies for a number of different types of equipment, but essentially to avoid that member states would be competing against each other in the acquiring and distributing the equipment available. The second emergency measure, was to ramp up the production of medical equipment, and here the European Commission requested the European Committee of Standardization and the European Committee for Electrotechnical Standardization to make several European standards for certain medical devices and personal protective equipment freely available. And that we could do it just like this straight away. And the third element was to create a specific rescue capacity, a sort of creating a European reserve of emergency medical equipment. And then in terms of circulation, as you know, one of the first things in terms of lockdown was also closing the borders, but here the problem was to ensure that the necessary essential goods would remain available across borders. So the Commission took a number of measures to address these export bans that some member states had put in place to ensure that those essential goods would keep moving across the single market, and that was the so-called green lanes for allowing crossing borders for all this material. And the third element of the relief phase was the activation of the EU civil protection mechanism. This is something that is a sort of EU coordination of all the civil protection capabilities across the European Union. And this was mainly used to deploy quickly doctors to Italy, which was the first country hard hit in the European Union, and then to coordinate the repatriation of citizens that were locked in other countries within the European Union. So that I have to say it worked very well, and again it's a service that was already there, so it has been tested in the past and it could be activated extremely quickly. Now, if we move to the next slide to see a bit after all these initial measures, what is the impact on the economy? Well, I think that looking at this, this is basically PMIs, manufacturing and services. And if you look at the forecast, as I mentioned, that we issued today, well, the economic impact is very hard. We have, if I remember correctly, for 2020, we have in our spring forecast that we issued today a negative number around 7.5, I think 7.4 for the European Union. And you see a clearly drop for all these PMIs that in particular for the first quarter, in particular for services, because this has been much stronger heated. And we also are seeing now actual numbers for Q1 coming in, which are also, I mean, showing what you see in these PMIs, a very negative number for the first quarter of the order of -13 or something like this. What does it mean? Well, it means that that clearly there was a need to devise policies to support the companies to bridge this period. And here is something quite different, because it's not like the companies are facing a demand shock, but they are facing a closure of the economy, and with the uncertainty that at least at the moment of the closure was not clear at all how long it would take, and we are still facing quite a strong uncertainty in terms of how long it will take. So that requires a lot of policy response, and here we are on what I called at the beginning the resilience phase, meaning how we bridge this time of the big impact of the lockdown, allowing the economy and the companies to restart again and not to go in default or whatever, for being able to start the recovery once the economy gets going again. So a large number of measures, as I said, being taken at the EU level, at the national level. I think here you can see in a very summarized way what it is. I will try to briefly explain a bit each of these points that you see in the slide. So let's first of all, on the monetary side, I think that's pretty well known, because I mean, the Fed did a similar kind of measures, and a lot of central banks as well. But in particular, the ECB reacted very strongly and very quickly. They put in place temporary pandemic emergency purchase program with a volume of 750 billion of eligible private and public securities throughout the year, and longer if needed, as they said it. Then the second component is measures that ensure that banks remain reliable carriers for the monetary policy and they continue lending to the real economy. The longer-term refinancing operations, as well as a comprehensive set of collateral easing measures, is part of this component, and a new series of non-targeted pandemic emergency longer-term refinancing operations. This is all to support the liquidity conditions in the euro area financial system and contribute to preserving the smooth functioning of the money markets. Third, the ECB as a supervisor of the euro area has a role as banking supervisor. They implemented a number of relief measures regarding capital and liquidity requirements. And in addition to that, this framework also facilitated similar measures being taken by non-euro area member states' central banks, plus the activation of swap lines between the ECB and the other and some of the non-euro area member states' central banks, which could have otherwise experienced some stress in terms of liquidity. Now, on the fiscal side, the first thing that we did, and that was the initiative of the European Commission, is to use the escape clause, the so-called escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact, which is the framework that sets out the fiscal rules for the euro area member states. So this escape clause is to be activated under very exceptional circumstances, which is the case now, which basically means suspending the fiscal rules for the duration of these exceptional circumstances. Why? Well, because that allowed member states to take the necessary fiscal measures to support, in particular, the healthcare needs and to counter the effects of the lockdown. So basically, the removal of the fiscal rules allows what member states have done that you see on the other column, and the member states' discretionary measures and guarantees and liquidity support. So that's a sort of enabling clause for the member states to activate fiscal policy. Then we also adopted a state aid temporary framework in order to facilitate the support by the member states to a number of companies to go through this phase. And under this adjusted framework, temporary adjusted framework, the national governments may grant some typologies of emergency aid without prior notification to the European Commission. So normally these state aids are not allowed, except in certain cases, and countries have to notify to the European Commission, who has the authority of this policy, and then the Commission says yes or no, it is accepted. Now here, this support to companies to go through to bridge the crisis period can be done straight away. Then the third element that you see, the third bullet, is a number of measures to soften the fiscal constraint in the hardest hit member states. In particular, you see what is lending to support national unemployment schemes, so-called SURE, and additional healthcare spending. That means that countries can access the support, loan support from the European Stability Mechanism in order to be able to deploy quickly expenditures on the health-related sector. And then a reprioritization of the EU budget, in particular to soften the need for co-financing certain expenditures or investment, and enhancing the guarantees to the European Investment Bank to support direct lending to SMEs. So that's on the EU level, and then at the member states level, there are, first of all is the role played by automatic stabilizers, and in particular the schemes that support unemployment. And this is the very important part of it is that in a large number of countries you have schemes that allow the companies to keep to keep workers in the company by reducing working time, which is compensated by these support schemes. Meaning that the companies do not need to lay off the workers, they can be kept, and so you have a much softer impact on the labor market and on the domestic demand by this mechanism to bridge the period. Then a number of discretionary fiscal stimulus measures that have been taken by the member states, which amounts to something like 3.2% of GDP. And a big package of guarantees and liquidity provision measures such as tax and social security contribution deferrals, etc., which amounts something like 22-23% of GDP. So very, very big package. So now this is on the fiscal. Now let's see how this works, if it works. So that was one of the questions that Yvonne said at the beginning. Let's see what works, what not. So if we look at the impact of the monetary policy, I think I could summarize it in one word, is that indeed the monetary policy has managed to keep the spreads under control, spreads on sovereign bonds. And the EC intervention has so far succeeded in that respect, and clearly this intervention here is similar to what the Fed did in the US. Now, if we look at the fiscal side, the next slide, what we see is what is the impact of what has been done in terms of increasing fiscal deficits, and how this fiscal response is articulated. So what we can see is that the European Union came into the recession with a very sound fiscal position. That's good. And in terms of deficit, what we planned before the crisis was a positive 1% GDP, so a surplus, a budget surplus in 2020, which, as I said, means that the EU was in quite a good position to face now. Now, what do we have in the forecast that we issued today? We have minus 8.3 deficit for 2020 for the EU as a whole, after all the measures that have been taken. And what we foresee for 2021 is a deficit of minus 3.6. So a big fiscal effort. What we also see within that big fiscal effort, what it corresponds to the discretionary measures is something around 3 to 4% of GDP, and then the rest is the automatic stabilizers. So this is more or less half-half, I would say. The guarantees obviously do not have an immediate fiscal impact, and hopefully they will not have any impact, because those are contingent liabilities, and that's what I said. It's a very, very big part of the support package. As you can see, the major responsibility for the fiscal response is in the member states. So we don't have a federal budget in the EU. The EU budget is only 1% of GDP of the whole European Union. So it's very different, and that's why it was so important to use the escape clause of the fiscal rules to really allow member states to activate fiscal policy. Now, if we turn to the outlook, the next slide, what next? So that would be what we have in front of us, and therefore how should we define the recovery package? Well, what we see is that the economic activity will not return to the output level that we forecasted before the crisis. So as I said at the beginning, we had for the 2020 minus 7.4, and we have in the forecast for 2021 plus 6.1, which is largely a base effect, but surely remaining below the output level pre-crisis. And this means that the long-term growth potential will also be lower unless there is policy support. What is important to mention here is that for the EU, obviously this shock, the COVID shock, is a symmetric shock, but countries have different fiscal policy space, and this is therefore asymmetric, and the recovery is also asymmetric. And this is what the recovery package, I mean, it's one of the aspects that the recovery package wants to address. So now I come to the last part, recovery package, which, as I said, I don't have yet elements. We are not yet there, but I can name a bit what will be at least the aims of the package and the type of measures. So one element that the package will address is measures or policies that avoid an excessive divergence within the EU. So the cohesion aspect of the policy response. That's one component. Then there will be a mix of increased public investment, but also increased support or improve the framework for triggering private investment, or a combination of the two. There will be some proposals to address the deteriorating companies' balance sheets. And the investment will also take into account the prioritization of the medium-term kind of objectives or sectors that should lead the economy in the future, which is basically digital and green, which was the priorities that Europe had already before the crisis, but that needs to be also part of a component of the recovery package. And then obviously some reforms, structural reforms that will have to take place in the countries, and some sort of capacity for the EU to issue debt backed by the EU budget. That's basically what we can see as part of this package that should be ready pretty soon, which will mean in concrete terms that this package will contain some proposals related to the EU budget for the next 7 years, which was just before the crisis. It was being discussed with the member states. So the Commission had already made a legislative proposal that was being discussed with the member states. So now the Commission will put on the table a revised proposal in order to respond to the crisis with a different components and different kinds of instruments within the EU budget. So that would be it as a starting point from my side, and obviously I'm ready and happy to take questions, comments, as you wish.
Thank you, Elena. What I think is really interesting is here we heard, on the news that this crisis is an existential threat to the European Union when the borders were closed. But this, listening to you, this sounds to me like an exemplary effort on action on collaboration. What did it take on the ground to make this expedient collaboration happen, especially around the rescue fund? I know you had FC, but is Rescue EU just like the extension of what you had started with the Invest EU packages and also the FC together with the European Investment Bank?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, basically I would say that the nature of the things that have been decided is not different from what we had. So in a way is increasing the capacity of the existing instruments, or shifting them somehow to make them fit better for the current needs. So it doesn't require a kind of a change of approach or a complete change of the policy approach. So maybe that's something that helped to make the decisions quickly. But it's true that it's never easy. I mean, some of these decisions have taken lots of hours of discussion, but I have to say that compared to previous crises, I mean, the time within which these decisions have been taken is pretty short.
Yeah, and also the buy-in from the member states that seem to have been fairly smooth, hasn't it?
Well, yes, as I said, I mean, I don't want to minimize the difficulties in some of these decisions, and indeed, like what I mentioned, the unemployment complementary scheme and the access to the ESM ECCL credit line. We are now in the process of finalizing the implementing instruments, and the decision by the leaders is that all this should be working at the latest on the 1st of June. And in defining the implementation instruments, okay, there are still some difficulties, like how exactly you define what is the health related expenditure that you are supposed to do when using this loan from the ESM, this kind of thing. So it's not that it is so immediate, but what is, I think, clear is that everybody is there in finding a solution. Everybody has that approach.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience, and I was going to ask you the same. We have an echo. The question is what some of the structural reforms were already in place that now helped with the quick adjustment on the with the ability to react so quickly.
I think that I would point to a couple of things. I think that one element is the social protection system in Europe. So, and that covers including, I mean, it's the health system, but includes all the unemployment support and related things. So this is something that it is there. So you don't need to start defining from scratch. You just need to activate it. And as soon as the economic situation is what it is, this gets activated. That's one. So it's what I call the automatic stabilizers. It doesn't require a new decision and put it in place, a new system of implementation. And two, the guarantees and the support for SMEs, etc. There as well, we have the European Investment Bank, and we have a large number of national development banks, promotional banks, that are doing this job regularly. So in a way, the distribution channels are there. So that can be put in place, like all the support for SMEs, etc., can be activated very quickly.
Good. And we have another question. Paul Krugman recently compared the EU and US response on delivering payroll support and unemployment insurance. And he queried whether the EU approach assumes that workers will be able to stay in the same job when the crisis is over. We had talked about that in the lead up to this conversation. It was really, I mean, for me, amazing how fast some European governments have been able to disseminate the funds, unemployment and otherwise, new schemes that were developed. Do you want to address that a little bit?
Indeed, these schemes that are there to help keeping workers at job during this kind of crisis. Indeed, these schemes consider that those workers will be able to retake their jobs after the crisis. So it's really a scheme that it is specifically effective for this kind of impact, which will be the case for a number of companies, or even a large number of companies, because I mean the impact of the lockdown is something very specific. It's not like you are in a transition that you are changing structure of the economy, etc. true that there will be some that will have to change, but this was already a development that was ongoing. And here is what I mentioned, that investing in new sectors, etc., like digital green, was exactly that, was creating the employment in the sectors for the future. And that will require a different kind of support. That will require more like education, training, etc., to allow some of the workers that will need to move from current jobs or previous jobs to something new. So, but the bulk of the impact doesn't mean that all these people will have to change jobs, because most of the companies will be able to continue their business.
Yeah. And we have another question from an EICC member. He's convinced that the IMF forecasts are excessively optimistic and concerned about the ability of the EU to keep up the current intervention. And we had talked about that in the lead up as well. How long can the EU keep this up? And was Christine Lagarde's latest statement pretty much the we will do what it takes that her predecessor, Mario Draghi, put forth at the last crisis?
That's the one of the critical questions that I don't think it has a very clear answer, but not for Europe, for anybody. Is this uncertainty about for how long the economies will need support, and how long can one afford to stay in this sort of inactive situation and being able to come back. So I think that if monetary policy has been accommodative everywhere. Both advanced economies, but also emerging countries have taken measures. So that, I think, is there to stay for quite some time. And for the rest, I think that it will be a combination of restarting the economy and an intelligent removal of the support measures to allow this bridge really to be crossed.
Yeah.
So I think it's very difficult to say for how long.
Yeah, I mean, you're coming out of you're coming out of the closures, and I guess we have to see how the reopening is going to work, and if we will need to close again. There seems to be overall a lot of focus on guarantees and on funding by the ECB. How are we? I mean, how is that jiving with the discussion that we're having at the Constitutional Court in Germany on Eurobonds? Is that a concern? Are we going to circumvent them? What is your take on that? Are we finding another way of doing it without calling them Eurobonds?
I think that your question has three different components. One is the ECB policy to buy bonds, to buy securities, which is what the Constitutional Court expressed about. I think, I mean, I'm not really an expert on Constitutional Court decisions, but I think that this needs to be seen in relation to the ECB mandate and to the extent that ECB actions do not undermine the monetary policy mandate that they have, which I don't think it is the case. So I don't know what the court said, but in terms of if I put myself in the ECB shoes, that's the way they look at it. And otherwise, I mean, if a central bank would think that their decisions undermine the monetary policy mandate and the monetary policy targets, they would not do it, because that's the reason for the independence. The second element is the guarantees, that the fact that a lot of the measures are focused on guarantees. And I would say yes, because on the one hand, we think that we have an efficient way to make this liquidity available to the companies that need it to bridge this phase of lack of liquidity, because the EIB, the promotional banks, etc., that exist in Europe, and because we think that in this way the public sector is hedging banks from credit risk, and therefore they are less restrictive and less risk averse in the way they deal with the real economy. So that's the second element. And the third element, you mentioned the Euro bonds, or it's have been given many names, the Corona bonds or whatever. I think the issue here is the question of joint responsibility. So who is guaranteeing these bonds? And that's what I don't know whether it will be. It will not be a joint sovereign guaranteed bond, but there are different ways that you can imagine to construct such a potential guarantee for issuing bonds, like, for instance, to support green digital projects that are properly European, of a European nature rather than purely domestic or national nature, and have a sort of EU budget plus a combination of national contributions that can play as a guarantee. But this is what is not yet proposed. I mean, it's in construction, I would say, but it will not be the kind of sharing sovereignty, let's say, because I think that's not yet mature.
Yeah. Will this be the final case for European budget? For joint European budget?
Well, I think if the European budget is 1% of GDP, we cannot dream, because it's a very small one. So I think there's still some way to go. But the notion of having a joint capacity to act, and I think that will start by investment. Then the rest, I think, will follow later. But this idea of we need a joint capacity to respond, I think it's quite clear.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Todd, do we have any more time for a couple more questions, or where are we time-wise?
We are at time. We had said this would run until 10:45, so.
Oh, okay. I had one more question. I mean, I know the answer to it, but has the UK joined one of the some of the EU measures in the since they're not yet out? I know they're not part of the conversation, but have they joined, for example, the procurement?
I cannot tell you exactly if they have joined this particular measure. What I see is more from actions that are being taken for the international, where in most of the cases the UK is very much aligned with the EU positions. So therefore, sure, I can say that they are very aligned on that, on that moratorium, on joint efforts for developing vaccines, treatments, making them accessible, and all these initiatives, they are very much on the forefront. And like the last Monday pledging conference that was co-organized by the European Commission plus a number of countries, of which the UK, to collect pledges for these vaccines development and treatments and so on. Yes, but okay, on the domestic front, discussions are difficult, to say the least.
Yeah, Brexit will still happen. You know, just one last comment on your end. So looking ahead from where you're sitting, in the heart of Europe, in the heart of all this decision making, what's your personal outlook? Are we better prepared now? Are you happy with the structural changes and the structural measures and the regulation we put into place? And will that help us to face the next crisis in a more prepared? Are you? I mean, there will be another crisis. How do you feel about the European preparedness and collaboration among member states and collaboration with other countries?
Well, I'm an optimistic. Otherwise, I would not be doing this job for so long. But I think for true, we have much more instruments now than we had. Only looking back at the sovereign debt crisis at 2012, basically. There were a lot of new instruments put in place. Now we have much more, and I think there is a clear understanding that there is a need to move ahead. So yes, I think we are in a better place. If you ask me personally, I think its steps are too small, too slow. But I think realistically, that's what it is. So I would like to see some of these decisions, like the SURE or like the access to the ECCL, much broader, much forthcoming. But I think it's a very good step what has been taken, and it also opens, because there are things that can be developed. As I said, I mean, you have the first step of an instrument that can grow.
Thank you. So I think with that, we have run out of time. Thank you, Elena, for joining us today and sharing your insights on this. Todd, thank you for hosting. And I would like to invite everybody to our next program on May 21st. And we are hosting a discussion about the economic outlook post-COVID-19 for Europe. And you can sign up on our website and RSVP for the program. We have a poll, a quick poll that we're doing about how you enjoyed the program. Please answer it. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
As Yvonne said,
bye.
As Yvonne said, do this right. As Yvonne said, thank you so much for attending today's webinar, the EU response to the COVID-19 outbreak, from managing the emergency to relaunching the economy. Deep thanks to Elena Flores for joining us from Brussels, and Yvonne for facilitating this conversation. As Yvonne noted, we encourage you to stay in touch with your local chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce for information on all our upcoming webinars and events, including that May 21st event webinar entitled Europe and the Great Lockdown, Economic Outlook and Policy Priorities to Reopen the EU Economy. We'll have Christian Orsini and Ben Carliner from the EU delegation to the United States presenting. Be sure to look for a recording of this and other EACC webinars and events on our YouTube channel. Thank you for responding to the survey. I'm going to close that now, and hope you have a good day. Everybody go wash your hands. Farewell.